The sword that chose no one. On the old alien world called Varkel Prime, there stood a sword in the center of ancient ruins, floating in the air as if held by invisible hands. No chain held it, no stone touched it, yet no living being had ever made it move in 1,000 years. It was not stuck in rock or locked in glass, it simply waited, glowing faintly with soft blue light, humming like a sleeping storm. Alien species from across the galaxy had come to this place, hoping to claim the sword and its power. Warriors, queens, assassins, and prophets, many had tried, but none had succeeded. The sword had rules that no one understood. It chose no one, and it refused everyone. Some called it cursed, some called it holy, but all agreed on one thing: only the worthy could lift it. If such a being even existed, it became a ritual, a test, a joke, and a dream all at once. Crowds would gather each cycle to watch hopeful champions walk up the stairs, place their hands on the hilt, and watch as nothing happened. The blade would glow cold and still, and the crowd would laugh or sigh or look away in disappointment. Then one day, a small ship entered the sky, uninvited and damaged, trailing smoke like a comet losing its life. It crashed just outside the ruins, hitting hard enough to make the dust rise for miles. No one rushed to help. The watchers only watched, curious if another fool had come. From the wreck, a figure crawled out, a human, blood on his face, dirt on his clothes, and confusion in his eyes. He limped forward, one hand on his ribs, the other shielding his face from the sun. He had no armor, no honor marks, no banner or flag, just breath, pain, and questions. Aliens nearby laughed, calling him Dustwalker, weak bone, and fragile creature, words often used to mock humans. But the human didn't stop, didn't respond, didn't bow or speak. He simply walked, step by step, toward the sword. The guards tried to stop him, but the elders allowed it. They thought it would be fun to watch him fail like the rest. The crowd gathered around again, ready to see another failure, to point and laugh, to add one more name to the long list of the unworthy. The human stood in front of the sword, blinking at it like it was some kind of dream. He didn't understand the customs, the history, or the fear around it. He only saw a floating weapon in the air. He reached for it without a word, without a prayer, without a single drop of fear in his eyes. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the sword moved. It shined brighter, the blue glow pulsing as if it had found something it had long forgotten. Gasps filled the air, followed by silence so deep it made hearts stop and breath freeze. The human closed his hand around the hilt, and the blade came to him like a bird landing on its chosen branch. He didn't struggle, didn't strain. He simply held it as if it belonged there all along. The ruins shook softly, as if the planet itself had noticed what just happened. And all around him, aliens stared in silence, frozen by what they could not believe. The sword had chosen a human, something that no record, no vision, no prophecy had ever predicted. A voice in the crowd shouted, "It's a trick," while another screamed blasphemy, and someone else yelled, "Kill him." But none of them moved yet. They were all still too stunned, too afraid, too unsure of what they had just seen. The human looked at the sword, then at the crowd, blinking like someone waking up in the middle of a storm. He spoke just 3 words, simple and soft, but they echoed like thunder in the silence. "What is this?" he asked. A young alien female stepped forward slowly, her skin pale green, her eyes wide with fear and wonder. She was a scholar, not a warrior, and her name was Talira. She had studied the sword her whole life. She walked closer and answered, in a shaking voice, that sword chose no one until now." And in that moment, everything across the stars began to shift, because the ancient weapon of Varkel Prime had finally chosen its wielder, and it was human. A heartbeat of its own, glowing brighter with every second it remained in his grip. Its hum wasn't loud, but it echoed inside every ear nearby. vibrating in bone blood, and memory like a forgotten sound waking up. The crowd stood frozen, not out of respect but confusion, disbelief and fear. No one cheered, no one moved. No one knew what they were supposed to do when a human had succeeded where thousands of great warriors had failed. Ethan had no idea what the sword meant, what it had done, or why everyone stared at him like he had just broken the galaxy's rules. He didn't feel powerful, only dizzy and sore from the crash, his mind still trying to understand where he even was. But to those watching, Ethan wasn't a lost outsider anymore. He was a threat to everything they believed in. The air around the ruins turned heavy as guards slowly raised their weapons, aiming at the man holding the floating blade. An old priest shouted something in a language Ethan didn't understand, his voice shaking with rage and fear. That's when the girl Talira stepped forward again, lifting her hands and shouting louder than them all. "He doesn't even know what this is," she screamed, placing herself between Ethan and the soldiers. The priest snarled, his robes brushing the dust as he marched forward, calling her a traitor, a heretic, a fool. But the crowd hesitated, because even in their fear they could see. The sword had not harmed Ethan. In fact, it almost protected him, the blade glowing stronger each time someone moved against him. Talira looked back at Ethan and whispered quickly, "Don't let go of it, or they'll tear you apart." He nodded, tightening his grip as the energy buzzed through his arm like electricity trapped under skin. She took his wrist and pulled him away from the ruin's center, slipping through the edge of the crowd while the guards hesitated. The moment broke like glass. Some gave chase, some argued, others stood too shocked to act. By the time the first plasma bolts flew, Ethan and Talira had vanished into the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the ruins, and so began the escape of the one they now called the chosen outcast. Down in the deep halls of Varkel Prime, where dust and silence ruled for centuries, Talira lit the path with a glowing orb of light. Ethan followed her, the sword still humming quietly at his side, casting strange shadows against the ancient walls. He kept asking questions, but she only said one thing: "You're not safe anymore." They reached an old chamber filled with crystal screens and floating stones. Talira called it the Archive of the Dead. She waved her hand and the walls came alive with light, showing old images of warriors, beings from different ages, planets, species. Ethan looked around and asked what it was, and Talira replied, "The ones who tried before you." He expected to see stories of failure, of heroes who gave up, but instead, the images showed something worse. Each warrior disappeared completely after touching the sword. No records of death, no body, no trace, just erasure. She explained the legend in whispers. The sword chooses only one every 1,000 years, but it demands a price, and now it had chosen Ethan, and he would have to face the trials, or vanish like the rest. Ethan didn't know if he believed in destiny, legends, or magic swords, but he knew this: he didn't want to die without answers. Talira studied the energy readings from the sword and confirmed it. It had begun the first stage of awakening. That meant the planet would soon respond, opening gates that had been locked since before her ancestors were born. The sword, called Akareth, was never meant to be a weapon. It was a trial maker, a judge, a key to something buried beneath the world. She told him that unless he passed 3 trials, one of courage, one of will, and one of soul, the sword would consume him. No one had ever passed the first trial before, because no one had ever survived long enough to find it. Ethan asked, "Then why help me?" And she replied without hesitation, "Because I want to know the truth too." The galaxy had lied about many things, about power, about worth, about humans, but the sword had chosen him, not them, and now they would find out why before the galaxy tried to silence him forever. Because high above them, messages were already flying from orbit to system to empire. A human had awakened the blade, far from Varkel Prime, in golden halls orbiting suns and thrones carved from asteroids. Alien rulers heard the news and panicked. The High Council of Varian declared emergency meetings, demanding to know who Ethan was, what he had done, and if he could be stopped. Others saw opportunity. Some whispered that maybe the sword had finally found what it waited for. And maybe the age of alien rule was ending. Some called for his death. Others wanted to study him, and a few wanted to worship him as the inborn flame. But Ethan knew none of that. He only had a map now, drawn by the sword itself, showing him where the first trial would begin. It led into the sandstorms beyond the ruins, into a canyon called the Maw of Dust, where light didn't reach and voices were said to vanish. Talira packed supplies, tied her braid tight, and looked at him with steady eyes. "You still have time to run," she said softly. "But if you stay, you carry the weight of empires." Ethan looked down at the sword, then at the map, and said with a half-smile, "Guess we'll see how heavy that is." And together, they stepped into the desert, two outcasts, one sword, and 1,000 watching stars. Of whispers, of heatless wind that curled like breath from a dying god. Every step into the Maw of Dust felt like walking into a memory someone else had forgotten, a place that rejected the present. Ethan walked beside Talira in silence, the sword strapped across his back, humming louder the deeper they went. The canyon twisted unnaturally, the walls carved not by nature, but by hands too large and tools too strange to belong to this age. No maps worked here, no signals escaped. And even thoughts felt heavy, like they had to push through invisible fog. Talira called it the trial grave, where champions had once entered, but none had returned, not even as bones. Ethan didn't care about the legends anymore, he just wanted answers. And the sword wasn't talking. But as they reached a stone gate cracked by lightning and dust, the sword finally pulsed in his hand and whispered a word he didn't understand. Talira looked at him and nodded, her voice calm but tense. "This is where the first trial begins. It won't test your strength." And then the ground opened beneath Ethan's feet and swallowed him whole. He didn't fall far, but the darkness felt endless, like falling through time, not space. When he landed, there was no pain, just silence, the kind that makes your ears ring and your heart beat faster. He stood slowly and looked around a circular chamber, smooth black walls, glowing softly like moonlight trapped in glass. In the center, something moved, a shadow with no body, no face, only shape, like a wound floating in air. It spoke in broken voices, echoing every failure Ethan had ever faced, from childhood shame to battlefield panic. "Why did they leave you?" it asked in the voice of his dead friend. "Then, you let them die," in the tone of his former commander. Ethan didn't answer. It wasn't real. But the guilt it awakened was the trial wasn't about fighting monsters. It was about facing the ones already living inside him. The shadow took the form of people he had lost, people he had failed, people who had betrayed him, and people he had let down. And worst of all, it became him, the version he feared. A killer, a coward, a man shaped by survival, not purpose. The sword vibrated against his spine, but he didn't reach for it, not yet. The copy of him smiled, cold and hollow, and whispered, "If they call you chosen, then why do you still feel empty?" Ethan clenched his fists, not to fight, but to keep from shaking, from screaming, from agreeing. He stepped forward and faced his shadow self, not with fire in his eyes, but quiet in his soul. "You don't define me," he said, his voice steady even as the chamber trembled. The shadow struck, but the sword flew into Ethan's hand like lightning to its storm. With one swing, the illusion shattered, not from force, but from will. The chamber cracked, and a beam of light shot through the ceiling, painting his skin in glowing patterns. The trial mark burned itself onto his arm, a circle with a broken line through its center. The light faded, and he found himself standing back at the canyon's edge. Talira waiting, tears in her eyes. "You passed," she said, her voice shaking from relief. "You're still here." Ethan didn't speak right away, his body was whole. But something inside him had changed. He looked at the sword again, wondering if it was judging him or simply recording every choice he made. More than fear, he felt weight, a growing pull from the blade. Like it expected more, always more. Talira opened her pack and handed him water, then held out a data crystal. Etched with symbols older than her species. It's the location of the second trial. She said, "But Ethan, it won't be about you next time." He frowned, confused, and asked, "Then who will it test?" She lowered her gaze and answered, "Me." The second trial required sacrifice, and the sword's energy had already chosen its next subject. Ethan wanted to argue, to refuse, but deep down he understood. This was what it meant to carry the sword's path. Above them, in orbit, several warships arrived, silently, black vessels with no flags, known only to those who feared them. A bounty had been declared on Ethan across 3 star clusters alive. Dead or broken. Whispers spread faster than fire. Some said he was a false prophet. Others said he was the destroyer promised in forbidden texts. A few believed he was the flame of change, and those few were already gathering in hidden corners of the stars. But Ethan knew none of it, not yet. He stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the desert below twist in heat waves and shadows, the sword resting against his shoulder. Talira stood beside him, her fingers brushing the new mark burned into his arm, her expression unreadable. "I'm not ready," she said softly. And he replied, "Neither was I." And then they turned together and began the journey to the northern ice fields, where the second trial would begin, and one of them might not return. Across the frozen plains echoed like music from a forgotten time, rising and falling under their boots. The north was not just cold, it was alive, watching, waiting, breathing beneath layers of blue and white silence. Ethan wrapped himself in the thermal cloak Talira gave him, but no fabric could protect the heart from what waited ahead. The sword stayed quiet now, as if even it feared this place, feared what it might wake by speaking. Talira walked beside him, her face pale, her breath sharp, and her eyes locked forward like she knew she wouldn't come back. This was the second trial, and it would not be his to face alone. They reached a structure buried half in ice, shaped like a broken crown, ancient and cracked, with runes flickering faintly along its walls. Ethan stopped and whispered, "This isn't a temple, it's a prison," and Talira nodded. Inside this place the sword would test something worse than pain, loyalty. The door opened without touch, sliding silently as if afraid to disturb the cold. A tunnel led them deep underground, where the ice turned black and the air carried no warmth, not even from breath. Glowing lines followed them down the walls, matching the sword's faint pulse with eerie precision. Talira explained the truth at last. The sword didn't just test warriors. It recorded them, their choices, emotions, pain. It fed on them, storing them like memories inside the planet's heart. The second trial was not a test of Ethan's soul, it was hers. He tried to stop her, begged her to turn back, but she shook her head and said, "You passed by standing against your own fear, I must face mine." The chamber below opened like a wound in the world, a round room with mirrors that didn't reflect light, but regret. Talira stepped inside alone, while Ethan waited at the edge, fingers clenched around the sword's hilt. And then the doors sealed him out, not to protect her, but to keep him from interfering. Inside, Talira stood before a dozen flickering visions, all from her past. All the people she had failed or betrayed, her mother's disappointed face, her teacher's angry voice, her sister's final cry before death, all twisted into perfect guilt. The sword didn't show lies, it showed the truth she tried to bury. Sharpened into blades of memory, she dropped to her knees, choking on old pain that felt fresh again, bloodless wounds opening across her chest. But instead of begging for mercy, she whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for Ethan. "I walk through this for him, not for me," she said. Let him live even if I don't. The room trembled, the mirrors shattered, and one final memory formed not of her past, but a future. A vision of Ethan, broken and alone, sword buried beside him. Forgotten by all, she screamed and ran forward, not to escape, but to reject that future with everything left inside her. The light swallowed her whole, and then silence returned to the room. Ethan waited outside, his hand trembling as he felt the blade burn against his back. He didn't know what happened inside, but he felt it in his bones, like a scream too deep to hear. When the doors opened again, Talira stepped out alive, but changed. Her eyes glowed faintly, her skin marked with glowing symbols across her collar and chest. The second trial had accepted her sacrifice, and now she carried part of the sword's will inside her. She fell forward, and Ethan caught her in his arms as her body trembled with cold and unseen pain. "I saw what you'll become," she whispered weakly. "Don't let it happen." He held her tighter, his voice low and raw. I won't. And as the chamber behind them sealed forever, the sword lit up with new fire, its second judgment complete. But in the far corners of the galaxy, others had seen that light too. A dozen hidden satellites blinked alive, their scanners locked on Varkel Prime's icy north, in the halls of warlords and kings. Alerts flashed in red. Second trial activated. The Council of Firesight sent assassins. The Bone clans issued war orders, and one old emperor whispered, "The sword wakes for war." Ethan and Talira knew none of it, not yet. They rested in a nearby cave, Ethan standing guard while Talira slept under layers of heat cloth, her hands still twitching in her dreams. He stared at the stars through a hole in the cave roof, wondering why the galaxy feared the sword so much. And deep down, a part of him was starting to understand. It wasn't just power the sword offered. It offered choice, and to those who ruled with fear, choice was the most dangerous weapon of all. Ethan looked at the blade resting beside him, its edge now glowing with twin lines, the first trial's light and the second's fire. And he knew when the third trial came, it wouldn't just test him or her, it would test everyone watching. It wasn't dawn, it was fire, low in the clouds, spreading like veins of blood across the heavens. Ethan opened his eyes to the scent of burning air and the distant sound of engines. He stepped out of the cave and saw them ships in the sky, black and sharp like blades tearing through the wind. Talira woke to the same noise, rising fast with panic in her eyes, already reaching for her gear. "They found us," she said. Not as a question, but as a fact. The sword hummed against Ethan's back, hot and restless. Sensing what was coming before they even moved, down the slope, dozens of soldiers in bone-colored armor marched with quiet steps, weapons glowing in their hands. These weren't scouts or hunters, these were killers sent to erase something the galaxy feared too much to let live. And at the front of the army, wearing a silver cloak and eyes like sharpened glass, stood someone Ethan once trusted. His name was Kale Dorn, a human, one of the few Ethan had fought beside in past battles. Before the sword had ever touched his hand, they had survived wars together, buried comrades, and once promised to protect each other until the end. Now Kale pointed at him and said only one word: surrender. Ethan didn't raise his sword, he just stared, confused, wounded more by the betrayal than the weapons. "Why?" he asked, voice low. "Why would you join them?" Kale stepped forward, shaking his head slowly. "Because they offered me peace, and you only bring fire." Talira moved to speak, but Ethan raised a hand to stop her. This fight was his. Kale continued, "You think the sword makes you chosen? It makes you cursed, Ethan. You carry the death of empires in your grip." The army readied their weapons, but Kale didn't give the order to fire. Instead, he said, "Drop the sword, and I will spare her. I swear it." And for a terrible moment, Ethan believed him. His hand hovered over the hilt, the hum of the sword growing frantic. as if it knew what he was about to do. But then Talira stepped in front of him and said, "If you give it up now, everything we've survived means nothing." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled, because she too had once believed peace could be bought with surrender. Ethan looked at Cale, his oldest friend, now a weapon held by the enemy. Then he looked at Talira, her body still marked by the trials she faced for his sake, and he made his choice, not with rage, not with hate, but with understanding. "I'm sorry, Cale," he whispered, then drew the sword in one clean motion. The blade erupted with light, not fire, not lightning, but a pulse of memory, of truth, that knocked the first line of soldiers back without touching them. Cale staggered, shielding his face, as the sword's energy revealed everything he had hidden behind duty and lies. The truth that he feared Ethan because Ethan reminded him of who he used to be. The battle exploded without warning. Blaster fire lit the cliffs. Energy bolts struck stone, and Ethan moved like a man possessed, not with fury, but with purpose. He didn't kill for revenge, he fought to survive, to protect, to make sure the sword's judgment reached the next trial. Talira fought beside him, her stolen blade cutting through armor with precision and grace. They didn't fight as soldier and scholar. They fought as two who had chosen each other when no one else had. Cale reached for a detonator on his chest, yelling, "If I can't stop you, I'll bury you under this mountain." But before he could press it, Ethan charged, not with the sword, but with a fist, slamming him into the ground with a single strike. The detonator flew from Cale's hand and shattered against the rocks, useless and broken. The battlefield froze, the surviving soldiers unsure if they were still following orders or running from something they didn't understand. Ethan stood over Cale, breathing hard, his voice calm as he asked, "Is this what peace looks like to you?" Cale looked up, blood on his lip, and for the first time, his voice cracked. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid you'd succeed. Afraid the galaxy would follow you instead of them." Talira stepped forward, but Ethan didn't move. He just stared at the man who used to be his brother in arms. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Ethan replied, then turned away. He didn't kill Cale, he left him there, alive to face what he had become, and that was the sword's real lesson in this trial. Not power, not violence, but mercy in the shadow of betrayal. The sword pulsed once, and a third mark burned itself into Ethan's chest, a ring split by a single line of flame. 3 trials, 3 truths, and still the sword had not gone silent. It had one more purpose, one more secret, and it would only reveal it when the time was right. Because in the dark corners of space, a gathering had begun, those who feared Ethan, and those who now called him leader. From nature, but from warships, every major empire, silent council, and outlaw kingdom had turned their eyes to one world. Varkel Prime glowed on every star map like a wound refusing to close. The sword had chosen, the trials had spoken, and now the galaxy held its breath. Ethan didn't feel like a hero, he felt like a fuse waiting to burn out. He stood at the edge of the ancient arena, carved into the planet itself, where voices once rose in cheers and now whispered in warning. Around him stood thousands alien diplomats, commanders, assassins in robes, and unknown things hiding behind armor and shadows. Every faction had sent a witness, not to support, but to decide what to do next. Above the arena, sky cameras hovered like flies, broadcasting his image across 10,000 worlds. And deep below the stone, the sword pulsed quietly, waiting for the final choice. Talira stood behind him, her face hidden by a ceremonial hood, but her presence a flame behind his back. She had survived her trial, risked her life, then hunted and cursed. Yet here she stood still, loyal and proud. Ethan looked out across the crowd and raised his voice. Not like a king, but like a man who had seen too much. "I didn't ask for this," he began. "I didn't come here to lead anyone. I just survived when I wasn't supposed to. No one interrupted, because his words were not scripted. Not polished, they were real. I held this sword because it came to me, not because I wanted power, he said, lifting the blade slowly into the air. But now I see what it's really for, not to destroy rulers, but to remind them who they serve. The sword lit up in his hand, not just blue or white, but a spectrum of color, memory, and motion. It projected visions into the arena, not illusions but truths, images of fallen heroes, broken promises, buried lies, and what could be if things didn't change. Some shouted, calling it manipulation, trickery, or worse, a trap to force rebellion. Others fell silent, watching their own secrets exposed in flickers of light. The sword showed what empires had hidden, how peace had become a chain, how fear had replaced leadership. And then it showed something else: Ethan alone, older, battle-worn, surrounded by death. The sword was not offering him victory, it was warning him. To carry it any longer would mean war, blood, and a life filled with endless fire. Talira stepped forward and placed her hand over his on the hilt, her voice strong. You've proven your worth, Ethan, but this blade doesn't demand more than you're willing to give. The crowd leaned in as he lowered the sword, not to surrender, but to make a choice no one expected. I will not lead an army, he said. I will not conquer, and I will not kneel. He planted the sword into the arena floor, and it sank into the stone like it belonged there, vanishing in light. The crowd gasped, because no one had ever released the sword after being chosen. It was supposed to devour, to demand, to rule, but Ethan had ended its cycle. Not by death, not by blood, but by choice. A hush fell over the world. Then across the network of systems watching from afar. And then something impossible happened. One by one, the witnesses began to bow, not to a king, not to a god, but to a man who had been offered everything and chose peace. Talira stepped to his side, her voice calm but proud. Let this be the final trial, not of one man, but of all who rule. And in the silent arena, under a sky full of ships and eyes, a new age began, not from conquest, but from courage. Far above, in the silent throne chambers of dying empires, some screamed, others wept, and a few quietly stepped down. The sword had ended more than a trial, it had ended a story the galaxy had repeated for too long. And though Ethan walked away from the arena unarmed, he had never been more powerful. Talira walked beside him, hand in hand, not as a guardian, but as an equal, as the first to believe when no one else did. The sword was gone, but its memory burned in every world it had touched. Ethan didn't know what would come next, maybe chaos, maybe peace, maybe something in between. But he knew one truth, deeper than all the others. Sometimes, the greatest power wasn't lifting the sword, it was knowing when to put it down. And across the galaxy, where shadows once ruled, light began to rise again, not because of the blade, but because of the human who let it go. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the stars whispered not of fear, but of hope. Left behind was louder than war. No blade shimmered, no trial loomed, no energy burned through the veins of the earth. And yet, something deeper had awakened, across worlds, across species, across the quiet space between stars. Ethan didn't wear armor now, didn't carry the blade or command legions. He walked as a man again, free and unburdened. But freedom had its price, and it followed him like a shadow with no source. Talira walked beside him on the surface of a new world, one untouched by war or ruins or watchers. It was green and open, with clouds that danced and soil that sang when it rained. They had come here not to hide, but to begin, because ending the sword's legacy was not the end of their journey. It was only the beginning of something else. Something harder, something honest, rebuilding not with power, but with presence. News of the sword's disappearance spread like wildfire across the galaxy. Some called it a trick, a fake peace meant to lull the weak. Others believed it was divine, a sign that the galaxy had passed its test at last, but most simply didn't know what to believe anymore. Because for the first time, no one ruled the narrative. Ethan had returned truth to the people, and truth was louder than any empire's voice. Still, not all celebrated. There were pockets of resistance, remnants of power clinging to the old ways. One warlord promised to summon the sword back through sacrifice. Another declared Ethan a demon in human skin. But no matter how many times they called for it, no blade answered. The sword had returned to sleep, buried not in stone but in choice. And Ethan's choice could not be undone by fear. Talira now served as a voice to many. Not through politics, but by telling the story as it happened, not as myth, but memory. She spoke to young ones on colony ships, taught alien children on distant moons, and recorded the truths the old rulers wanted erased. Ethan refused most interviews, declined all titles, and ignored the voices begging him to lead a new federation. He had led enough, and he understood now that leadership was not about command, it was about courage and silence. In time, others began rising new names, new faces, new kinds of leaders who carried lessons, not weapons. And when people asked what the trials had taught him, Ethan gave the same answer. The sword didn't change me, it reminded me who I already was. That message spread further than any sword swing, any war cry, any throne. And because of it, the stars began to settle again, not in fear, but in balance. Balance earned through suffering, and kept through truth. One evening, Ethan stood alone beneath a twin-moon sky, watching shadows drift over a quiet field. He felt the world breathe, this new world they had chosen, not for its power, but for its peace. Talira joined him, holding a small crystal glowing faintly, one of the few artifacts that still held trace energy from the sword. She handed it to him without a word, and he held it in both hands, surprised by its warmth. It still remembers, she said softly, but it no longer judges. He nodded, understanding without needing to speak. Some echoes never leave, but they also never need to return. He buried the crystal beneath a tree they had planted together months ago, its roots winding through soil like gentle promises, and as he covered the earth with his bare hands, a quiet hum rose in the air, faint, warm, and satisfied. The sword's last breath. Not a warning or a command, but a farewell. And in that farewell, a blessing not for warriors but for builders, dreamers, and those who choose peace before pride. Years passed like soft waves, and Ethan grew older, not weaker, just quieter. He smiled more, slept longer, and learned to listen deeper than he ever had in war. Children grew up hearing the story, not as legend, but as a path they could walk to, one of courage without cruelty. And Talira remained at his side, not as protector or follower, but as partner, mind and heart united in purpose. Together, they lived not as icons, but as reminders that even the oldest weapons can become seeds of hope, if held by the right hands, that even a galaxy built on violence can be softened by a single act of refusal, and that no blade, no throne, no force in the stars was stronger than the simple decision to do what's right. The sword would return only if it was needed, but Ethan believed, truly, that maybe it never would be, because this time the galaxy had a chance to heal without it.